Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening at Shaolin-Lu, the beautiful Shaolin-Lu. For our evening, I am Maureen Aylward, the Executive Director of Town Green, and we are just so thrilled to have the Massachusetts Climate Chief, Melissa Hoffer, with us, and the Deputy Climate Chief, Jonathan Schrag. Thank you for being with us. I am going to introduce them and hand it off, but I will say that after the presentations, we will have a live Q&A where we'll be holding the microphone and you can just raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Melissa Hoffer is the Massachusetts Climate Chief, heading up the Office of Climate Innovation and Resilience within Governor Healey's administration. She served in the Biden administration as the acting general counsel and principal deputy general counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency. Hoffer led the EPA's Office of General Counsel until November 2021 and served as principal deputy general counsel. Prior to that, she worked in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office as chief of the Environmental Protection Division beginning in 2012 and was named chief of Attorney General Healey's newly formed Energy and Environmental Bureau in 2015. Hoffer led the office's litigation against ExxonMobil for deceiving Massachusetts investors and consumers about the risk climate change poses to Exxon's business and global financial markets, and the impacts of its fossil fuel products on climate change. She received a JD from Northeastern University School of Law, a certificate in environmental management from Tufts University, a master's in education from the University of Massachusetts, and a Bachelor of Arts from Hampshire College. Thank you for being with us. Jonathan Schrag currently serves as the Deputy Climate Chief and the Director of Investment for Decarbonization and Resilience in the Office of Climate Innovation and Resilience for the Commonwealth. In that role, he focuses on the Inflation Reduction Act strategy for Massachusetts and developing funding and financial strategies for resilience and decarbonization. With a specialization in regulatory strategy and innovation for the energy transition, Schrag's previous projects have included the Office of the Massachusetts Attorney General, where he co-authored recommendations for a new regulatory framework to encourage the transition of gas utilities in Massachusetts. He's also been the Deputy Administrator of the Rhode Island Division of Public Utilities, where he led a grid modernization planning process. And he's been the Executive Director of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Cap and Invest program for the power sector across 10 northeastern states. Please join me in welcoming these two wonderful people to join us this evening.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I have to say, I am so thrilled to be here. I've never been in this building before, and it's just extraordinary. So this is an incredible backdrop here. So we're really, really pleased to join Town Green in Rockport this evening. I want to thank Maureen Aylward for being such a terrific leader here in Rockport and organizing this important discussion for us tonight. I also wanted to thank the members of the Rockport, Essex, Gloucester, Manchester by the Sea Select Boards, who I think are with us this evening, town officials who have joined us this evening. I think that Senator Tarr may be here. Hello, very nice to see you, Senator. I'm glad you could join us this evening. And Fish and Game Deputy Commissioner Taken is also here. If you could just, thank you very much. So I'm joined obviously by my deputy, Jonathan Schrag, without whom we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do. So I'm so pleased to have Jonathan here. And I also had the benefit that he drove and managed all the traffic tonight. So thank you, Jonathan. So at the outset, it's really worth noting that right now we're experiencing not just one, but three really major transitions. We've got the shift that's happening from an economy that's based on fossil fuels to one that's based on clean energy. So that alone would be huge because fossil fuels are really baked into our economy. There's really nothing in this room, this podium, the chairs that you're sitting in, that isn't based on carbon. So our economy is very much intertwined with carbon, which is why it's harder to deal with than a pollutant like a chlorinated fluorocarbon, which was the basis for the Montreal Protocol. So really, really different and would be enough in and of itself. So everything really depends on how quickly we can make this transition off of fossil fuels. That's in our energy sector, in our building sector, in our transportation sector. Super, super important. Second, we already have, and I know I don't need to tell you this, but we have disruptive climate change happening here simultaneously, and it's accelerating. So what we see now are the impacts of climate change. They're happening here in Rockport. We've seen, tragically, these impacts unfolding across the Midwest and in Texas this week. Many of you might have seen the news reports coming out of Mexico where they're enduring an extreme heat dome right now. Many people impacted by it, and of course other species. So we've seen the pictures of howler monkeys falling dead out of the trees because the temperature has reached 113 degrees Fahrenheit in some of these locations. So disruptive climate change is here, and unfortunately it's going to continue to get worse, and we can expect those trends to happen on a more accelerated basis. So what does that mean for this clean energy transition? It means that we've got to be building that new energy system, the new transmission, the new transformers, the new substations, the ways that we're going to be powering electric rail. Those things have to be done simultaneously with bending our emissions curve. If you remember back to the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we heard so much about bending the curve so that we could reduce the impacts of more and more sick people coming into an already overwhelmed hospital system, you can kind of think of it as analogous to that. We really need to bend the emissions curve. And so that means focusing on some of the super pollutants like methane, for example, over the short course. Really try to get that down while we're also dealing with these impacts. So we have to design and engineer our clean energy system and our other infrastructure in a way that's going to withstand these impacts. That's not something that we've done. It's why our infrastructure tends to fail in some of these events. You might see airport tarmacs that are too hot for the planes to take off, or you might see rail, like light rail happened in Portland during the Pacific Northwest heat dome a few years ago, unable to support the operation of those lines. So our infrastructure, none of it was built for the climate that we now have. It's a very important thing to keep in mind, and it will characterize part of what we're trying to do as we build towards resilience. We need to better select the technology, has to be the kind of stuff that can withstand the impacts of climate change. And third, it's us. It's the people. So as we're all adapting to climate change, and we're talking about an energy transition that's about machines and fuels, and we're talking about infrastructure and that stuff in the built environment, there's also us. And how is it affecting us as people, as individuals, as cultures? I frequently look around at how important our relationship to the natural world is to us. For many of us, depending on what our background may be, your culture has particular foods, or maybe textiles, or you live in a certain area like this where it's embedded in how we define ourselves. And as these risks increase, not only are we losing some of the things that are defining ourselves, but we also face impacts to our families and to our communities. So we're going to be tested, not just us, but societies are going to be tested, and already are, frankly, if you look at this through the global south, where impacts are already much more extreme. We're going to face some challenging times. So, one of the things that we all need to do, whether we're in leadership roles or otherwise, is to lay the groundwork for what can be a very positive transformational change. What do we want to take out of this? What are the lessons that we've learned from our experience of an orientation really towards the natural world that has yielded an unsustainable result. So what we're looking for here is a lasting and fundamental recalibration of our human relationship to the natural world. That's a big part of where we need to aim with this, and we have to do a good job of taking care of each other through this transition. So when you hear me talk about the clean energy transition, I would ask that you think about it in the context of these related dynamics that are all happening at once. It's an awful lot of change that's happening. And it's one that's unprecedented for humans. Humans certainly have been through extraordinary change throughout the period of evolution in which we've lived on the planet, but these are unprecedented for humans. And so these are the kinds of changes that's going to require a lot of flexibility, a lot of nimbleness, a lot of compassion, and a lot of ability to think differently and with novelty about how we're approaching the changes that have already occurred and those that will happen. So we've got a really limited window, you have probably heard this before, in order to make quite steep emissions reductions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in March of last year, so this is about a year old now, came out with a pretty big report, and they warned that accelerated action to adapt to climate change in this decade, so in the 2020s, is essential to close the gap between the adaptation that we need and what we already have. So we've not been very focused on adaptation. For those of you working in this space, you might remember that adaptation was kind of a dirty word about 10 years ago because people were afraid that it would distract from our efforts to invest in decarbonization or reducing emissions. Now we know that because we have lagged in part to probably the best disinformation campaign in the history of the world by the fossil fuel industry, but because we've lost about 40 years in really dealing with emissions reductions, now we have to deal with adaptation and we're behind. So the IPCC is saying you got to really double down on adaptation. And they're also saying emissions should be decreasing by now, which they're not, they're going up, and we need to cut them in half by 2030 if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. So just a little quick note on what that means. 1.5 degrees centigrade is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's a measure in comparison to pre-industrial levels. So pre-industrial meaning before the Industrial Revolution, before we started burning all of these fossil fuels. So there's a framework convention on climate change to which the United States is a party, and it meets every year. You might have heard about these COP meetings or conferences of the parties. And there was an agreement negotiated in the Paris COP, you might have heard it referred to as the Paris Agreement, where the convening countries agreed to really try to keep warming limited to somewhere between 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels and 2. So that's what those numbers mean. And 2 degrees centigrade is 3.5 or 7 so degrees Fahrenheit. It's really hot, is what you need to know. And you also need to know that those are policy-driven numbers. They're not necessarily the numbers that keep us safer. So the bad news is that currently we've just experienced 12 consecutive months for the first time in the history of humans of global average temperatures in excess of that 1.5 degrees centigrade. So many scientists right now are saying we've already exceeded that safer Paris level of warming. And that is, that's a huge, huge problem for us. But it also means we really have to get very focused on adaptation. So here we are with this task of trying to have emissions while continuing to have a functioning economy, while continuing to build resilience, and while beginning to really think about what these changes mean for us in the broader context. So for government, it really means nothing short of an immediate resetting of our priorities. And this is true for private sector as well. So that means we have to find really new ways to work together, and government needs to find very new ways of doing business. And that's a little bit about what Governor Healey's aim was in creating the Office of Climate Innovation and Resilience. We're here today to talk a little bit about coastal resilience in particular, and I wanted to think with you especially about nature-based solutions to coastal resilience. So in preparing for this talk tonight, I took a look at our flood projections for Rockport. And you can view these as well. Coastal Zone Management has a website, And on it, you can look at our sea level rise and coastal flooding viewer. Has anybody in here done that? So several of you are familiar with this. And that map predicts, and it will, it shows, it's a visual depiction of what you can expect in terms of flooding during certain storm events, assuming the same pace of sea level rise that we've been experiencing. So looking at that, I can see that it's right around the corner in 2030, several locations here in Rockport, including Bearskin Neck, Atlantic Avenue, the T-Wharf, are or will be highly vulnerable to serious flooding. And those risks increase to other areas, to adjacent areas, including this venue, as we move further towards 2050 and beyond. So probably everybody in the room understands, but maybe it's worth saying if you don't, as ocean temperatures rise, sea level expands. It's just like heating any other kind of water. So as it gets hotter, it expands, and that's what causes the sea level to rise. Other things that are contributing to it are the melting of glaciers, for example. That's also happening, driven by climate change. We've had record-breaking ocean temperatures this year. Have you all been tracking the ocean temperatures? So if you have, you know that we're experiencing multiple marine heat waves, unprecedented coral bleaching. And what that means is we can expect to see here, for example, a very active hurricane season. So all that energy that is stored in the ocean from this excess warming, this heat that's in the ocean, can drive more powerful hurricane seasons. So if you think back to 2005 when Hurricane Katrina happened, the ocean temperatures then, were sort of among their highest. Well, the ocean temperatures that we see in the Atlantic Ocean right now are hotter than what we had at the time of Hurricane Katrina. So these are related, interrelated climate impacts. You've got the warming of the ocean, which is causing the sea level rise, but is also igniting more powerful storms that make communities like this one in particular, and all of our coastal communities, quite vulnerable. So one thing to think about with all this, and I always like to make sure that people understand this, is that, if we had a magical switch here tonight, and I wish that we did, and it was the switch for all the global warming machines, everything that was emitting greenhouse gases, and we could just switch that off, that wouldn't end our problem because of the atmospheric residence time of carbon dioxide, which is on the order of centuries or millennia. So what does that mean? It means that everything that we've emitted already, that is already in the atmosphere, is going to be up there for quite some period of time, causing these impacts. So when you hear, people like me or climate scientists, sort of ringing the bell and saying, hey, this is a 5-alarm fire, that's why. So it's super, super important that we help people understand that fact. We are already in for it because of what's already been emitted. And in fact, the German government-backed Potsdam Institute, maybe some of you saw this, just issued a study in Nature a couple of weeks ago where they were trying to calculate what's the cost to countries in the world of dealing with climate change just from the pollution that we've already emitted, not anything else. And it comes out to about $39 trillion a year by 2050 globally. And just to give you some sense, the global, our global GDP is like $105 trillion. So it's a huge amount of money just to deal with the impacts of it from what we've already emitted. So we want to stop putting more pollution into the atmosphere as quickly as possible. So, as a state that has 1,519 miles of shoreline, how are we going to go about this process of adapting? How do we make ourselves more resilient as we work to also simultaneously bend this emissions curve? So I thought we should maybe start by taking a second to think a little bit about what resilience means. So the IPCC defines resilience as, this is a quote, the capacity of social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance, this is the important part, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, their identity and structure, while also maintaining their capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. So if you think about it, resilience, it's like absorbing and then releasing the energy of a blow, bouncing back, adapting, and still maintaining essential identity and transformation, or maybe even leaping into possible futures. That's what resilience is about. So that's what we're aiming for here. There was a 2018 report that was done by UMass's Boston Sustainable Solutions Lab. It's called Governance for a Changing Climate. And they talk a little bit about the relationship between resilience and the different ways that you can think about it. And I think it's worth talking about that for a second too, because resilience increases in a couple ways. One, when we reduce the hazards that threaten a system. So that's mitigation. So if you're reducing emissions that are causing the harm, that's one way that you can think about resilience. Resilience increases when we stop or halt the threat to the system. And here we're talking the threat to the system is greenhouse gas pollution. It also increases when we reduce the system's vulnerability to the hazard. So that's when we're talking about things like nature-based solutions or other infrastructure changes that can make us actually physically more resilient, or some of the social changes that we can make to make communities stronger, educate people about climate change, set up networks to support each other. Those are also things that can enhance resilience. So two different ways to get at it. All the emissions reductions, all that mitigation, reducing the hazard, that's one piece of resilience, and then making ourselves stronger so that we can withstand those impacts. That's another way to think about resilience. So in this light, everything that we're doing to decarbonize buildings, to protect the forests that draw down carbon dioxide and sequester it, to rapidly shift our energy supply away from fossil fuels and toward wind and solar and battery storage and geothermal, all of these efforts are building a lot our capacity for resilience, because they both reduce the hazard, they reduce the emissions, and they also are going to get us on a path to build greater resilience. So as we are making our coasts more resilient, as we are making our forests more resilient, as we are making our farming practices more resilient, as we are making our fisheries more resilient, we actually make ourselves more resilient. And, I really want to emphasize that point too, because there's really no separation, right? And sometimes I think about, well, what is the real lesson of climate change? And I think that's really it. To the extent that we have forgotten the life-giving link between humans and the ecosystems of which we are a part, climate change is here to remind us that our own human thriving is very closely linked to the thriving of the natural world. And so as we are learning about the resilience of these systems in the natural world and helping to build those for our own human survival, that's where we come back into this learning or this remembering about the importance of that relationship. So nature-based coastal resilience approaches. They are inspired by nature. They might be copied from nature. You might have heard them referred to as biomimicry, but they require designers and scientists developing them to become really very intimately familiar with how coastal ecosystems work. So if you're thinking about a salt marsh, for example, and how important our salt marshes are, and they right now are having a difficult time because of sea level rise. So protecting those salt marshes is very, very important. But what do they have to teach us? We can learn that a salt marsh is really good at absorbing that incoming wave energy, to protect what's on land. But at the same time, it's also providing habitat. It's increasing biodiversity. It's improving water quality. So something like a seawall doesn't do that. It doesn't have that sort of multi-solving functionality to it. And the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has said that a single square mile of salt marsh stores the carbon equivalent of 76,000 gallons of gas annually. So here you've got our humble salt marsh, and it's creating habitat. It is protecting us during severe storm events. and at the same time, it's drawing down and sequestering carbon. So really important and a very good example of what a nature-based solution looks like. So oyster reefs, wetland and salt marsh restoration, coastal parks, we see these around Boston that are designed to actually receive flooding. New building designs, we're seeing some of this happen as well, that actually anticipate there's gonna be flooding on those lower floors, and they build to accommodate that flooding. Moving stuff, getting your emergency generator out of the basement, sticking it up on your roof. You gotta be careful with storms there too, but that kind of thinking is what we need to be doing. So these are all ways of thinking about how the environment is going to change and building that into design in a nature-based way. So across all the sectors, we need to be aligning our regulatory frameworks and government policy making, and this goes for federal government and state government and local governments, so that they are aligned with goals like advancing nature-based solutions for resiliency and, really overall with all of our climate goals. When you think about what we're going to be facing with sea level rise, it's uncertain. And if you look at the data on it, is it going to be 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100? Is it going to be more than that? Will it be less than that? The wild card is how humans will respond. So if we respond rapidly and are able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions rapidly, then the chances of keeping sea level rise a little bit lower increase. So the wild card is really us in all of this. So we probably have some time to deal with sea level rise over the course of the next couple of decades. That is a more slow-moving threat. We understand what the projections are. We have some time to make different decisions and help cap the total rise that we anticipate. That is not so with storm events. Right now, for coastal Massachusetts, we have a real and present danger of substantial damage to our communities from storm events. So there's a real urgent need for us to focus on resilience when it comes to the impacts of storms now. So now I just want to kind of go through with you a couple of concrete policies that we're pursuing and talk to you a little bit about what those do. So some of you might be familiar with our MVP program. We now have an MVP point 2. It's our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. And that really helps support, or the first version of it really helps support communities in creating plans for resilience. The second version of it now focuses on addressing root causes. There's more of an intentional focus on social vulnerability within communities and moving from planning to implementation, because it's not enough to keep planning right now. Now we need to understand what we're going to do and then actually start doing it. So these grants help municipalities and communities convene core teams that co-develop and implement projects to build resilience, and there's guaranteed funding for implementing projects. So those are big, important changes associated with that program. We have the unfortunate acronym of our SHMCAP. It's our State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. But importantly, it was the first such plan of its kind. We have to file basically a hazard mitigation plan to FEMA every year in order to be eligible for financing under the Stafford Act in the case of an emergency. But Massachusetts, under the Baker administration, was the first state that actually combined that with our climate adaptation plan. So that's really significant because it's saying, we understand that our vulnerability to future disasters, that might be FEMA qualifying, increases with climate change. So we want you to also understand what we're doing for adaptation. So it complies with our current federal requirements for state hazard mitigation, and it maintains our eligibility for federal disaster relief. This year, in her budget, the governor has proposed a disaster response and resilience fund. I don't know if any of you were tracking that, but one thing that we're seeing, and maybe you have some direct experience with it here, is that lots of the climate-driven weather extremes that communities across Massachusetts are facing do not necessarily qualify for FEMA relief. So you can have some pretty significant damage in your town or municipality, and you may not qualify for federal dollars. So Massachusetts is one of only 2 states in the country that didn't have some sort of dedicated disaster response fund. So we put that into the governor's proposed budget with thanks to Senator Comerford and for having this idea and for being such a good advocate of this concept. And it would be funded with 10% of capital gains, which in a good year, which this is not, will be about $70 million. But what it will do is allow the state to provide some funding to communities that desperately need it after the impacts of a climate-driven weather event that aren't going to be covered by federal dollars. So we heard an awful lot about that over last summer. We had many communities here from out in Hadley in the western part of the state, Conway, here, Leominster, you know, you name it, North Andover. People really experienced some difficult extreme weather events, and so this would allow us to do more to help those communities, and importantly, it will allow us to ensure that they are building back resiliently. So that's a very important aspect of it as well. We have started our Resilient Coasts program. So this is our the state's first attempt at this, comprehensive strategy to protect waterfront communities like this one and ensure a strong, resilient future for our shoreline. So this work is being led by a new position at the Office of Coastal Zone Management. The Chief Coastal Resilience Officer will be leading it. The officer will coordinate with communities across state agencies. I'm excited to share with you today that Deanna Moran, if some of you know her from Conservation Law Foundation, who is expert in this space, has joined the administration to fill this role, so we're very excited about that. Part of this program will be establishing coastal resilience districts. So these are areas that are going to share similar climate impacts, physical characteristics, and then can benefit from shared resilience strategies. One thing we heard repeatedly from municipalities was, you know, the sense that you kind of have to come in individually and study your own sort of unique problems, when in fact, many of these problems are common to municipalities across the board. And so there was really a desire to think more collaboratively about what kinds of solutions can work for everybody. And this is very important because you all know this, but not all of our municipalities are similarly situated in terms of their access to funding or even their staffing levels to be able to think about things like this. So this is a way that we can share information and learning across the board that will benefit all of our communities. We are going to be coordinating with our agencies also to review regulations and policies, including those related to wetlands protection. Some of you may have seen this already. We've had proposed Wetlands 1.0 regulations come out that will make it a little bit easier to do permitting for some of the kinds of projects that I've been talking about. That work is going to be overseen by Alekson. If folks knew her from the city of Boston, she just recently joined the administration, and she will be our new Coastal Zone Management Director. She brings a lot of understanding, having been working in the Boston mayor's office on these issues about coastal resilience. So we're very excited to have her come on board. We formed a coastal resilience task force. This is external to guide this work with representations from communities, from businesses, scientists, nonprofits, and environmental advocates. Some of you may know that we apply, there's a lot of federal funding right now across the board under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, some of which was for resilience. A lot of it was focused on decarbonization. But we have applied for $60 million funding from National Oceanic Administration's Climate Resilience Regional Challenge. So we worked on this with 55 different community partners. And if we are successful in obtaining this funding, what this grant would do would allow us to protect critical coastal infrastructures, many of which are, you know, connected to each other, advance projects that reduce flooding in particular, restore vital ecosystems. We were talking about salt marshes before, and importantly, develop financing mechanisms for carbon sequestration and land protection. So we'll hear about that in August, but fingers crossed, because a big question with all of this, of course, is funding and financing. So that leads me to some of the work that Jonathan and I have been doing. The executive order that established my office also directed me to provide recommendations to the governor at the 6-month mark, which was last June. So those recommendations are available on our website. And one of them, the first two, actually deal with this question of funding and financing. Because right now, Massachusetts is not unique in this regard, but we don't really have a sense of the overall level of investment that is required for us to meet our net zero 2050 goals set forth in our, and these are mandated goals mandated by a piece of legislation called the Global Warming Solutions Act that passed back in 2008. So we don't really have a sense of that or the different economic actors on whom those costs will fall. And we want to make sure that we understand them, because then that can help us plan and identify the appropriate funding and financing mechanisms. So for any of you who have run a family budget or a business, or have, had any kind of role in trying to advance a project, you know that if you don't have, if it's not wedded to a budget, it's really pretty unlikely to happen. So looking at some of the barriers to implementing our very good clean energy and climate plan in the state, certainly having the adequate funding and financing to do that is a big one. So we want to take a look at that. We issued an RFP to do that. That work is currently just getting started now, and we're very much looking forward to having a sense of that. The same we're doing for resilience as well. We have a separate project underway that will accomplish two things. One is helping us understand overall how to just sort of finance resilience writ large, and that can be lots of things, from heat to flooding events to dealing with how we protect communities when we have smoke from northern or other forest fires, to storm events and so on. So that will be that first piece of work, is what are kind of the ways that we can support communities in doing that. And then the second piece of it is figuring out, really, because there are many, figuring out what are sort of the top half or dozen so most urgent resilient needs in the state right now, and having concrete funding and finance strategies in place for those. So these are really important things. Obviously, there's many things I could talk to you tonight about, the risks posed to the insurance. We're seeing things unfold in insurance markets in other parts of the country. People are probably very familiar with what's happened with insurers actually pulling out of locations in California and Florida. And we've certainly seen recent activity where insurers are halting coverage for locations even in the Midwest, due to the extent of losses that are being incurred due to things like extreme storms and derechos and hailstorms and the like. So there are places in Massachusetts where we are seeing folks unwilling to come in and insure. So when we're talking about resilience and we're talking about funding and financing, there are probably some opportunities for us to partner with the insurance industry that also shares the same goal in reducing exposure to insured assets. So that's something that we've begun to think a lot about, and begun to have some of those conversations that we hope will be productive, because it's very important for us to continue to have a stable insurance market. Obviously, these things have implications for real estate markets and broader financial markets as well. So I've just gone through some specific and concrete policy goals that we're pursuing now, new programs that we're very excited about that I think will be particularly relevant to you all here. But know that this is just the beginning with these programs. So there's a lot that we're all going to need to do, and the state won't be able to do it all. So I was so pleased to see how many of you are here this evening, because it really will be an opportunity for us to work a lot with local communities too. So these are evolving conditions. As I said before, it's hard to tell exactly what's going to happen with them. But if we're being very honest, we must, given where we are right now, we know that there will be some degree, and perhaps even some significant degree, of managed retreat from the coast. That will be an important aspect of coastal resilience, and some of that's already happening. When I was thinking about talking about this, because this is such a challenging topic. I don't know about you, but I've lived on a small farm in Barrie for the better part of the last decade, and that land is just such a part of me. I can't imagine really living somewhere else. So having conversations about what would it mean to not be able to be somewhere or to have to move are really hard conversations. And obviously the state is never going to be in a position of like directing a community to retreat, or directing a homeowner or property owner to retreat. I do think it's worth starting to think about the conversation. And one way that I think about it, and maybe you have had this experience too, if you have cared for an aging parent, and it's kind of like that situation. You know, there was a point where my dad passed away 3 years ago, and you know, there was a point in his early mid 90s, where my stepmother was falling a lot, and my dad was picking her back up. You know, my dad had congestive heart failure. They both had a lot of health issues, but they wouldn't tell anybody that it was happening. It was like this little secret that they had, and my dad would complain like, oh, his back was hurting or something. So we finally figured out what was happening with it. And so you could see what that trajectory was. We knew what was going to happen with our parents. And so we had to start taking some steps to begin to get them ready for their next phase. And they were still independent in some ways, but they needed more support. And then, that allowed us to have more concrete and candid conversation about that. And that conversation went something like this. Like, okay, so you can still drive, you can still be in the house, please stop power washing the barn, and we'll get you some more help at home. But when you can't drive anymore, or when you're not able to continue to support your beloved, then we're going to have to start talking a little bit about maybe moving to a smaller place. So maybe we have some experience with that in our lives, and you can start to think about how this conversation might work when it comes to coastal retreat. So there's a study that came out. I wanted to talk to you a little bit this evening before I turn it over to Jonathan. This is a 2014 article that was in the journal Nature Climate Change. And this is by social scientists. And they were kind of looking at this problem, like, why are we so unsuccessful? Every time we go into a community, we try to talk about managed retreat like it goes disastrously. We bring these beautiful charrettes, and people hate us, and they tell us we don't know what we're talking about. That was sort of the gist of it. And so what they learned was, like, the people who live in a place, this is so obvious, like, they're the experts on it. So you can't come in and tell them what to do. You have to really listen to them and start to have them tell you, well, what would make you really think you have to do something different in the town? So they kind of set out this, they called an adaptation pathway. And they begin with low-cost, low-regrets activities that minimize present risks, prepare for future actions, and minimize the exposure of new assets to future damages. So then when this triggering event occurs, and for this particular community, in their model, it was going to be flooding of a key right-of-way in the town that happened more than 5 days a year. So then they would take the next step along this adaptation pathway, which would be stringent controls over new development in that area and steps to prepare for the location of critical infrastructure, dwellings to more elevated parts of the town. Then they identified a second triggering event, 2 floods in a year impacting critical infrastructure and the viability of housing. Then the next step that the community agreed was, okay, then we would do managed relocation of all of our low-lying critical infrastructure, like this was stuff like a firehouse or like a school, and habitable dwellings to more elevated parts of the town. Then there was a third and final triggering event, the breach of they had a barrier dune in this town, the breach of that barrier dune that resulted in waves breaking in the town, and that would be then a permanent inundation of low-lying areas of the town. That's when the town agreed that, okay, when that happens, then we're gonna move everything to a higher elevation. So that might not be the right approach for every community, but I thought it was a really useful thought experiment because you have to get super concrete about it. We can't move everything at once. We're not going to do it now because we don't know what's going to happen. But to start to think like, okay, well, what would those things be that would make us do something different here? I think that's very helpful to have that structure. So we're going to be engaging deeply with these questions of resilience in the context of coasts and otherwise, and asking ourselves and having some of these candid conversations about how will we know when it's time to take a next step. And that won't be the same thing for every town, obviously. So with that, I think I just want to leave you with a thought that these are hard conversations. So I've just come up and talked for about 20 minutes or so, and we haven't even scratched the surface. Some of you may have seen I had the great privilege and humbling experience of traveling with the governor to the Vatican a couple weeks ago, and which was absolutely amazing. And we would have all been, I think, so proud of the people from Massachusetts who were there, and even people who were, had had prior contact with Massachusetts, who were now in different positions around the world in the federal government. But the thing that was really most striking to me was a conversation that I had with the governor of a province in Kenya that was flooding while we were at the Vatican summit. And 300 people had died in his community, and a couple thousand more had been displaced. So here he is, and he spoke so impassioned about this, in this room with scientists, with governors and mayors coming together, with the pontifical academies, to talk about climate. And here he is trying to manage this climate disaster, from where we were in Rome. So I just want to say, I understand that it is sometimes hard to hear this stuff, and if you're like me and you go home and you read about it and you think about it, it's pretty heavy, and it's especially heavy if we know young people or have young people close to us in our lives and think about what the future is going to be like for them. So you can take a deep breath and just know, like, we are really in this together. And I think that this moment, for all of the difficulty that it presents, it's tremendously generative. When is the last time that really everybody on the planet has been called to respond to something like this? And sometimes I think I'm just going to invoke my dad one more time. My dad was born in 1923, and he turned 18 in 1941. So he enlisted right away. He was 18 years old, and I remember him telling me, Melissa, I was ready to swim across the Atlantic Ocean with a rifle in my mouth to stop Hitler. And I think, like, wow, that is really what we need at this time. We need that kind of a moment. And President Roosevelt called on people and trusted that we would rise to the occasion. And we did. And I think we can here too. It's tremendously generative. We can get to think about some things that aren't working so good anyway for lots of people and do them a little bit differently. So I will leave you with that, and I am very pleased to ask Jonathan to come on up. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Maureen. And let me just have a moment to get this set up here. As I'm sure you can see from listening to Chief Hoffer's inspiring panorama of state policy and the personal reflections and the capturing the special moment we're in, how exciting it is to work with her and with Governor Healy at this special moment we have. So, for example, when she says, Jonathan, I'd like you to come with me up to Rockport to talk in one of the most beautiful halls on the East Coast on a beautiful summer day, and I'm all in right behind her. What am I going to talk about? I'd like you to talk about taxes. And so the only trick I have up my sleeve is to drop the screen and to make a deal with you that we are going to actually have fun. Is this working? Can you see it? No. Maureen, do we? We're going to make it work. And so, as we think about this special moment, Chief Hoffer has talked both about the policy issues related to resilience and decarbonization, and hi, thank you. Can you see something on the screen now? Here we are. Great. Magic sauce. With the light. So the lighting in the back may need to be adjusted to help see the screen. I'm not sure if there's a way to do that. Thank you. And so at the same time as we think about the panorama of state policy and the special moment that we're in, we also have to come to grips with very practical questions of how do we pay for this? How do we fund the resilience and the decarbonization that we need? And that's what I spend a lot of time thinking about. Massachusetts is actually in a pretty fortunate position. We have nearly 400 years of well-functioning democratic institutions. We have enormously talented and hardworking people who live in the Commonwealth. And we have the ability to work together in a way that is pretty unique among other states and as really a beacon of leadership. When Governor Healy goes to the Vatican to speak, it is demonstrating that leadership that Massachusetts has earned over decades. And we are, relatively speaking, better off as a society than many of the societies that exist that are coming to grips with the same physical challenges from the global south. And so we really have an opportunity here to lead and to figure out how we can make it work. And leadership is not necessarily spending the most. Leadership is not necessarily throwing ourselves over a wall. It is instead finding the ways that are smart, the ways that take our resources and leverage them, and the ways that will accomplish and create a pathway for others to follow so that other states and other countries look at Massachusetts and at the United States as a way to solve the climate challenge that we're going to face, both on the decarbonization side and on the resilience side. All of us, homeowners, renters, people who own stuff, who use stuff, we all know that stuff, we use it and it has to be replaced. And it is cheaper to replace things and to upgrade things at the end of their life cycle and to do it right. It's almost a truism in New England, right? Yankee frugality, to invest in quality and do it the right way. And when we think about decarbonization, that principle also comes to mind. We want to make sure that we are capturing every machine, every global warming machine that Chief Hoffer identified, called out, every furnace, every automobile, every kitchen that gets renovated. We want to make sure, now that we know the challenge ahead of us, that we are spending those dollars wisely, that we are building for the next century and not the last century. And the opportunity actually exists right now under something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which gives a whole lot of individual tax incentives to people to make a whole lot of upgrades. What I'm excited to talk with you tonight is about the special provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act that affect towns and the Commonwealth and all nonprofit entities, called direct pay. And so I want to talk about 5 things. First, quickly, what direct pay is, what the credits are, credit amounts and bonuses, some of the process, and then provide some helpful resources. I know we have a number of town officials here from the region, and I think this is crucially important both here, and we're learning new things both in the Commonwealth and at the municipal level, and we want to open that conversation up with you. And first, the lawyers say I have to give this disclaimer because we are talking about taxes. I am neither an accountant nor a tax attorney, and this is general information. Every municipality is going to need to come to grips with this through their own tax counsel on their own. So that presentation will be there as a disclaimer. And so what is direct pay? So the Inflation Reduction Act is the largest single investment in climate and decarbonization in US history. And one thing that it does, which is super exciting, is it takes a series of tax credits that have existed for a couple of decades, and it makes them available to non-taxable entities. So states, cities, museums, universities are all now eligible. Previously, those entities would say, well, we don't owe tax. We don't have what is called tax appetite. So we have no motivation to do the things that earn us a tax credit. What the Biden administration did was said, okay, you're a non-taxable entity, you want to do those things, you own a lot of real estate, you own vehicles, you own buildings. Here's what you do. You fill out a tax return. You say, I am a non-taxable entity, I owe 0 tax, and you include a list of all of the clean energy projects you completed. and then you get a cash refund for that amount, leveling the playing field between non-taxable entities and for-profit corporations who for decades have received these clean energy tax credits. That is a transformative act, and it really opens up the clean energy market for a whole series of landowners and buyers. And so that's what we want to talk about, how Massachusetts can take advantage of. There will be, in the year 2032, when these tax credits end, a government accounting office study of where the tax credits were realized across the United States. And I think a significant part of my job is to make sure that Massachusetts pops off of that map in 2032. So the tax credits apply to projects that are put into service from January 1, 2023 through the end of 2032. So it's really a decade of opportunity. We're in a period right now where everyone, colleagues of mine in other states, are frantically gathering papers and learning processes because we're at the end of the first calendar year of projects. So people are now beginning to file their tax returns for the calendar year 2023. And it's on a different time scale, which we'll get into. It's not the same timeline as your personal tax return. But what's crucial about this to remember is that unlike competitive grant programs, which have been abundant under the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, these tax credits are unlimited. So there is no cap. You often see an estimate that the Inflation Reduction Act will cost $250 billion or $400 billion. Those numbers are simply projections. They are projections that very skilled economists have used modeling an expected uptake of these tax credits. So quite frankly, we want to kind of break the bank, right? We want to implement as many of these projects as we can to realize those values and have the tax credits come into Massachusetts. In most cases, the value of the tax credit, the main one is the investment tax credit, the ITC, will be 30% of the basis of the investment. So it's a significant discount at the clean energy store. So how are we approaching it? We're doing it in 4 ways. First, we're trying to understand with these new regulations how the Commonwealth itself will file a tax return. Second, we're figuring out in forums like this how we can make sure that towns across the Commonwealth are aware of this. We're working with hospitals, we're working with nonprofit, low-income, affordable housing developers, and we're talking to municipalities, partnering with the MMA, partnering with the RPAs across the Commonwealth to make sure everyone is aware that this exists. And then the third bucket of work, we want to figure out ways to incorporate in green communities, in Mass Save, in all of the programs that people know and use well, how that value of tax credit can be incorporated into your long-term capital planning. So that when you think about building a new school, when you think about renovating a fire station, and there's an architect or an engineer who comes with perhaps an outdated idea of which type of energy technology is cost effective, we want to make sure that you're aware of these tax credits and can ask the right questions and persist to get to the low carbon, forward-leaning answer so that we are spending money right the first time around and we don't have to go back and redo the energy project in 10 years or 20 years. And then finally, my colleagues in the Federal Funding and Infrastructure Office and I are thinking about ways that we can get over a financing hump. In many cases, the tax credit still requires an outlay of capital from the municipality, and in many cases it might be 2 or 3 years, whether it's solar panels or ground source heat pumps, before you get that money back. And so we're finding, are there ways with the infrastructure bill that's currently proposed in the legislature to create a bridge loan financing product where municipalities could receive subsidized low-interest loans that would allow them to move forward with these projects. So the 4 tax credits that are relevant, and I hope these slides will be distributed to people who are here, and if not, you can certainly get in touch with us and I'll be happy to send them to you, are alternative fuel refueling, that's electric vehicle infrastructure to charging stations, renewable electricity production. So if you have solar projects that have been completed, every kilowatt hour, you get a small amount, a small payment. You have to calculate that payment and you get that production tax credit every year during those 10 years. Qualified commercial vehicles. So if you're a town that has vehicles and you want to convert the fleet, $7,500 per vehicle. And then the investment tax credit, which begins at a 6% level, and if you're using prevailing wage, goes up to 30%. If you're in an energy district, the city of Salem, Salem would get an additional 10% on top of that. So here are the amounts for each credit that I've just spoken through. Process timeline. This has emerged only in the last month. Effectively, what you need to do is pre-register, and you pre-register 120 days prior to your tax deadline. And there's a choice. You can decide to have a calendar year deadline or a fiscal year deadline. For the first year, everyone gets until November 15th. So now is the time, if you've done a project, to start gathering your papers. The key question will be, do you have 2023 projects? Everyone in a town knows whether they've redone a library or a school. And if you have, you want to start building your team, consulting counsel, completing a pre-registration form. There's a video on a web page at the Federal Funds Office with links that we have. Will allow you to step-by-step instructions for how to do it. And then you need to file the Form 990T by November 15th. Now, what if you don't have projects in 2023? Is this still relevant for you? It absolutely is. First, you want to identify any projects you have that are in the pipeline. Things that you know are getting built and that you need to file the return on. And there you're going to want to work with your financial advisors, your architects, make sure you're gathering documentation, that the project is completed and documented in an appropriate way. And you run through the same projects. If you have something that you're not sure that you're doing a project, you have an idea, you're going to want to inventory all of your future capital needs. Over the next decade, what does your vehicle fleet look like? What are your building needs going to be? The Clean Energy Store is offering a 30 to 40% discount for the next 10 years. And we want to make sure that all of those Massachusetts buildings and vehicles are upgraded now and not in the future. There's a process timeline that takes us from now till November 15th. And then we have a number of resources, in particular for all of the town officials. The Lawyers for Good Government elective pay resources has detailed webinars. Someone in your town should be appointed as the person to go deep on this. I'm happy to talk with them one-on-one and help them. I think Chief Hoffer asked me 6 months ago to do this. In part, this was because the competitive grants, those phases of the bipartisan infrastructure law are winding down. As we look ahead to the federal government and how we're going to be able to support the climate transition for the next decade, it's really these 30 to 40% tax credits for all of the good decarbonization that municipalities in the state have in their inventories. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have and make this available. And please feel free to come up after and ask me any questions. Thank you.
Check. Thank you. We're going to have some live Q&A right now, and Dick Prouty is going to join me. If you have a question for Chief Hoffer or for Deputy Chief Schrag, just raise your hand and I'll come and find you. Dick, I have an extra one right there. Val has the first question.
Thank you. Val Gilliman, City Councilor in Gloucester. I also chair the WeMo group for Women for Elected Municipal Officials. Thank you, both of you. One of my thoughts as I listen here and I look around this room, I love seeing some of the young folks up here, but if we could also intertwine into all these great initiatives, think about ways that we can incentivize our schools to provide more courses in our high school and middle schools on the importance of this. Because sometimes a particular class is offered and everyone jumps in and they start looking at rising seas and what parts of Gloucester are underwater, and it's a project, but it's only, and I thank you for being here. I would love all those slides. I'll be calling you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question.
Does this work?
Thank you so much for that comment, because last year, Governor started a Youth Climate Council, and I've had a lot of fun facilitating this year with our colleague, Sophie Collins. But one of the things that was really interesting in their application process that came in, many of them, their sort of initial exposure to anything about climate happened through school. And as you're saying, right now, the Commonwealth doesn't have an off-the-shelf climate curriculum, K through 12. We don't dictate, obviously, the curriculum at particular school district levels. But that is something that Secretary Tutwiler, who's our education secretary, is working now. And it was the #1 ask. So we convene councils to advise the governor. So there's, we have multiple councils, and this is the Youth Climate Council. And they are now preparing their recommendations, which will go to the governor in August. And their top ask is that. So it's a real priority. Thank you.
Jerry? I'll hold it.
Hi, my name's Jerry Sharfstein. I'm a resident here of Rockport. I also am a member of the Unitarian Universalist Society of Rockport. Our congregation is right around the corner, and last July we started generating electricity from our solar panels. And the only reason that project went ahead was because of the Deficit Reduction Act. No way we could have afforded that project if it wasn't for that. We've gone through all the steps of filing for a 30% return. I thought the date was May 15th, so we got everything in under the wire of May 15th, and we're looking forward to getting money back from the federal government. But I'd like to invite you both over to take a look at our building after this. It's right around the corner, and you can see our panels.
That sounds great. Congratulations.
And you're right, the deadline was May 15th, but everyone got an automatic 6-month extension. Good for you.
I have a question here.
Welcome to Rockport. My name is Sharon Kashida. I live in Rockport. I do want to mention that I worked for Mass DEP for 23 years in the Waste Prevention Bureau, so that is where I am speaking from today. I am very concerned about consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions, and my ask, I guess, for tonight is that, or my plea, is to incorporate product stewardship into the PCAP. Massachusetts is woefully behind our neighboring states. Right now, there is a small army of us that are working on a paint stewardship bill that has been filed 7 times in our legislature. It's currently in House Ways and Means. We need to get one over the finish line. We need to inform ourselves, but we also need to bring the manufacturers and the producers into the fray here, and building and creating products that are circular and not linear. We're talking about replacing things, and there are more and more studies that are coming out about consumption-based emissions, some as high as 45%. So I'm a member of the Mass Product Stewardship Council, which is an independent committee of Mass Recycle, the only statewide nonprofit that is focused on solid waste issues and reducing the climate impact of our stuff. And thank you again for being here today. It's really an honor to have you here.
You want to talk a little bit about the PCAP and circular economy?
Sure. The Priority Climate Action Plan, which was developed as a part of the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, was filed on March 1st, which was the deadline set by US EPA. We're currently working on the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan, which will be due July 1st, 2025. And that's an opportunity for us to look across all 6 sectors: industry, power, buildings, transportation, waste, natural working lands, and identify what are the core strategies, how do we measure them, how do we measure each strategy and what its contribution could be. Massachusetts has existing programs that have been measured in a certain way, and I think circular economy and consumption-based emissions is an opportunity for us to rethink some of that, for us to look at what the true impact is on consumption patterns. And I think the CCAP is an opportunity where we'll get into some of that work. And I'm happy to talk more with you about it. Thank you so much. Great. Let me just add that I think that the circular economy is one of, Time Magazine did a piece on the top 100 innovative companies around climate tech. And for Massachusetts, circular economy is the one sort of cluster where we are particularly invested and engaged. And so not just as an emissions reduction strategy, but also as an economic development strategy, as an employment for the future. This is something that will benefit both us and the world.
Thank you. Carol Bousquet from Ipswich. You may have seen in the Boston Globe over the last couple of weeks in Ipswich a big dam fight. Our town voted on removing the Ipswich Mills Dam. There's been a dam there for 400 years. This project is key to so many things: the resilience of the Great Marsh, the Gulf of Maine, the dozens of culvert and dam removal projects farther up the watershed. 58% of the town voted to remove it. It's non-binding. Our select board will make the final decision, we think, Monday. It's red alert time because we have cause to be concerned that this vote might not go through our select board. The project is completely paid for. The Ipswich River was declared endangered twice the last 10 years. And this dam removal project is considered one of the most important on the eastern seaboard at the moment. Right now, our action item is to write letters to the select board, and we're hoping you could perhaps write a friendly, persuasive letter to our select board, who will vote Monday. That's where we are. That's the question, is if the request. And we wanted to bequeath you one of these historic T-shirts, Secretary Hoffer.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Carol.
I will be sure to pass that to Secretary Tepper. Thank you.
Not sure a letter from you, Chief Hoffer, to the select board would be persuasive, but maybe.
Dick, Greg Fetterspiel has a question.
Thank you. And I just want to echo the appreciation for you coming this evening. I'm Greg Fetterspiel. I'm the town administrator in Manchester, small community. And as someone who toils day to day in municipal work, I know that we have our hands very full just with the day-to-day crises that come our way. And it's extremely difficult for small towns and actually all communities to find that capacity to work on some of these longer-term projects. And I'm a firm believer that as a region, we could collaborate more and work together on larger projects. But again, that takes support. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit towards the different capacity building options that might be available for us.
First of all, thank you so much for the question. And I think we both have some comments on this. But you know, with respect to resilient coast, that's exactly what it's supposed to do. But then that raises the question of the other non-coastal resilience needs that we have. And we know, for example, there's many communities in the western part of the state that have begun to work together on sort of regional solutions to their particular climate risks, mostly related to inland flooding, and also working a little bit with some other states. So this more regional approach makes a lot of sense, especially for the reason that you're talking about, which is getting back to this issue of not all municipalities being similarly situated when it comes to the resources that may be available to them. So that's actually part of the executive order that established, this office really mandates that we think about how to bring together communities and towns and try to help them start to think through, their climate solutions and also the resilience solutions. So Jonathan and the federal funding offices have been working a little bit to coordinate municipalities more. I'm going to ask him to speak a little bit about that. But we're also we are hoping to get this off the ground by the end of July, but we'll have like a dedicated person working in our federal funds office that's specifically deployed to work with municipalities, particularly low-income municipalities, on finding funding for resilience solutions. Because we realize that even the effort of putting together, a grant, or honestly, we've even heard complaints, frankly, about the MVP program, that the application process is a little bit complicated and lengthy and difficult for people. So we're also looking at ways to streamline that. But I would say we just spoke on this topic at MMA probably about a month or so ago. We hear that, and we are going to be working to help support so that coordination is there. We know that's really important. I've spent time in a number of cities and towns this year, including one in the western part of the state. That's got a $6 million budget. Half of it goes to the school. They've had two, repeat same kind of flooding events occur. They were able to afford a consultant to tell them what to do, but there's really not enough money, and there's not enough people in the town to take that additional issue on. So we see this as a critical need, and we understand where you're coming from on it, and so does the governor.
I would just add in the context, one municipal building, schools. There's Massachusetts School Building Authority, there's Mass Save, there's Green Communities, all of which offer different layers of funding and financing to help schools that want to tackle a school retrofit or build a new school. Those are 3 different programs with 3 different deadlines, 3 different application processes. So part of it is adding capacity, and everyone has their own technical assistance program, and for some people it's a staff person, another person it's a consultant, and you have to know how to tap it. What we can do is bring those people together and have a conversation and say, how can we streamline this? Let's take the perspective of the municipal administrator and, from Manchester, and how are they going to easily do this? Can we line up the deadlines? Can we make sure that the architect and the feasibility study each get funding, and that there's a way to move projects forward? And those are some of the conversations we're beginning to have. Everyone does have their own technical assistance program, and we're also trying to line those up and see who does what well, and is there a way to sync those up together into some form of a clearinghouse, a one-stop shop for municipalities and for moms and pops and for businesses, so you can really get the information that you need.
Alan, do you want to come out here?
Alan Macmillan, Pigeon Cove, right up there, about a mile away. We're talking about all kinds of fancy financial things you can do. There's one huge thing you could all do. How many of you go to the Rockport transfer station and leave your car running? There's a lady over here from Ipswich. I grew up in Ipswich. Behind Ipswich High School is an 8-foot tall, 20-foot wide billboard with a picture of an automobile sitting there. For every minute your automobile is idling, your car engine is idling, you're producing a cloud of greenhouse gases the size of a car. So if you're going through Gloucester, we're on an island, by the way, I don't know if you know that. The Annisquam River goes to the ocean in both directions. So to get here, you have to cross the bridge. If you're waiting at the Gloucester Drawbridge in the summertime when it's open, you can wait 15 minutes or more. When you have to wait that long, there can be as many as 50 or 60 cars on each side of the drawbridge waiting for it to open. 98% of those cars sit there for the 15, 20 minutes with their engine idling. And the question is, why are you not talking about this? This is a simple thing everyone can do. The amount of gas that's
Anti-idling,
wasted in
it's
greenhouse-
against the law. There's been a statute in place for a long
It is a
time.
law. And up at the Rockport transfer station, there's a sign that says $1,000 fine for idling more than 5 minutes. No one does anything
Maybe
about
talk to
it.
local enforcement officials? Yeah.
This is a statewide, nationwide issue, and no one's doing anything about it, yet we're adding greenhouse gases at a phenomenal rate, which is exacerbating the very problems we're talking about.
I think we're in radical agreement with you.
Yes.
When the
Thank you,
drivers
Alan.
park in front of my house and leave their trucks running, it drives me wild.
Insane.
Yeah.
Dick, there's questions up at the top.
Hi there, my name's Toby Warden and I live in Gloucester. I read an article in the Boston Globe from March that talked about the impressive work you're doing, Chief Hoffer, working with the agencies in Massachusetts, bringing them together in sort of a working group format. And I'm wondering if you can share any insights, lessons learned on that work that we might even be able to pull down to the regional level as we think about bringing people together, because I'd imagine all the people that come to those meetings have a bunch of other priorities, but they seem to be on board.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I'm happy to do that. So the governor has a cabinet. The cabinet is comprised of the secretaries of the various state agencies. So Health and Human Services, Transportation, and so on and so forth, housing. That cabinet meets regularly with the governor. When I joined in January of 2023, I started a climate cabinet. So it's all the secretaries, and we meet just on climate issues. And we've been doing that regularly on a monthly basis since the beginning of the administration. And we use that time for a couple of different things. One is to really educate everybody about the impacts of climate change, because while you have extremely, highly skilled, experienced people who are expert in their fields, they might not necessarily know about climate change, and they might not necessarily have a good understanding of how climate change affects their particular subject matter expertise. So we've had a number of speakers come in to present on various issues: the health impacts of climate change, systemic financial risk associated with climate change. We've had speakers come in and talk about impacts on youth, psychological impacts on youth, health impacts on youth of climate change. So that's one thing to do. Is I find, and it may feel a little surprising, I have a feeling it's a little bit different for the people who are here tonight, but a lot of people still don't really grasp what we're facing with it. And so that's a big obstacle when you're asking people to take time off of their busy plates. You look at the pie chart of their day and you're asking for a slice of that. They really need to understand why. So having a governor that's 100% behind it, and the expectation is, that we're all going to be working on it, that really helps. So that, analogous signal at the local level is very important. And then this opportunity to learn together is very important. And then what we found over the course of that, we do one other thing that's important just from an administrative infrastructure standpoint. The executive order that established this role creates Secretariat Climate Officers in every state agency. They weren't new positions, but they were people who were expert in their field. They understood how their agency worked, and they were interested in climate change. And those people really carry the work, working with our office of implementing all those recommendations I issued, or their own secretariat's own climate priorities, or perhaps the priorities of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan that the agency has a statutory obligation to complete. So that would be stuff like for DOT, for example, that would be electrifying the commuter rail, electrifying the buses, and so on and so forth. So that person is kind of the lead. So you need to have somebody own it. That's really important, who can be working with the climate body at your local level. And then what we found is, as people really began to build more trust, the secretaries wanted to use that opportunity to actually do some problem solving, because as you might imagine, we have a lot of mandates. We have a housing crisis in the state, for example. We really, really need new housing. So we want to accomplish that in a way where we're locating that housing in places, where it's needed, and also we want to make sure that it's not going to compromise our need to conserve natural and working lands to also meet our climate goals. If I were to show you a graph of how we get to net zero by 2050, we never reach net zero just by electrifying transportation and buildings, for example. You really need that last increment to be essentially pulled out of the atmosphere by trees and wetlands and sequestered in order to get to it. So that's really important. We really have to meet that goal. So thinking about how are we going to build the housing in a way that's compliant with our stretch energy code. Those are the standards that we have. For new housing, it's passive house standard. And for existing housing, it requires certain levels of decarbonization. Those add costs. So how are we going to do that in a way that is consistent with our climate goals? So that's an ongoing conversation that we're having. We're also bringing developers in to talk to them because they have very real concerns about financing those costs of compliance with the stretch energy code. So those are some of the things that we're able to do. We also, that venue has allowed us to really build relationships of trust with each other. So for example, when we were working on the economic development bond bill, it was because, I could just come right in and work with Secretary Howe very closely and with Emily Reichert, who's the executive director of Mass CEC, to really put together a study that showed us, well, you know what? We get a 12 times ROI on our investment in climate tech. So we've asked, if you haven't been tracking this is a bond bill that will raise money for economic development, and it's 1.3 billion of it will be for climate tech to support that same kind of ecosystem of new technology that we did with life sciences during the Patrick administration. So we actually had folks at the Donahue Institute do an economic analysis of the return on investment that we would get by putting that 1.3 billion in. And so it's a very good investment for us. It creates a bunch of jobs. You can read about this, the report is publicly available. But I think it was because we had, like how much interface would I have really had probably with the Economic Development Secretary without this structure in place? So that's a benefit of this that can really help because you know each other and you're calling each other and you're saying, does this make sense to you? And how about this? Or when I ask for something, it's better received and it's not seen as like undermining the goal of economic development. It's actually seen as boosting the goal of economic development. So I would say those that's sort of like a roundup of how to do that and the benefits of it.
I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions, unless you want to take one more.
You can take another question, and then we've got to get to the church.
Okay.
One more question.
I guess this is a follow-up from the previous question. I'm Randy O'Neill from Magnolia. Over the past few years, I've been working for a large energy company that is considered, if not the largest, then one of the largest producers of renewable energy in the world. My job was to actually talk to large corporations and utilities and talk to their sustainability leaders about how they're going to actually fulfill their climate goals, their carbon reduction goals, or even neutrality goals.
Thank you.
So I can say that there's tremendous interest in the investment community as well as the corporate community towards electrification of their business practices. The interesting thing is that what I would do is try to help match them up with potential projects that our company was doing for wind, solar, battery, EV infrastructure, et cetera. It was the only sales job I ever had where the easy part was to get the prospects interested, and the hard part was to get my own company interested. And there is a massive backlog of renewable energy projects right now. I think there was a Standard & Poor's survey that was done that if all of the projects that are backlogged right now actually came into production, we could literally, triple the output of the grid. The two largest impediments that I saw firsthand was one is that there was just lots of regulatory issues around where a company could either do on-site wind, solar, or get into a project where they could enter into a power purchase agreement. The second one, which I think is even bigger, is just this idea of connectivity. and transmission. And so my question is, what is the Commonwealth doing about, or has done about potentially alleviating some of these regulatory issues and really trying to push the grid towards being updated so that we can get this transmission in line and get these projects underway?
Thank you so much. This is such a good and important question, so thank you for that. And I know Jonathan's going to have some thoughts about this too. So last year, the governor issued an executive order that established a siting commission, and its task was exactly this. So I'm just going to translate a little bit what this means. Right now, let's just take solar. If you're developing a solar project in Massachusetts, which means you got to go out, you got to get financing for it, you got to get lined up somebody who's going to buy the power that's coming off of your project, all that stuff, it's going to take you somewhere between 8 and 10 years to get interconnected to the distribution grid. So it's like no one can do that. And in this period of time, and this has been this way for a long time. Part of my biography is also that I worked in private practice for a number of years before going to the Attorney General's office. And this is, I represented energy companies in that space. Like you can't really get financing if you can't demonstrate that you're going to have somebody, paying for your product. So it's really difficult. And in that intervening time, it's also gotten more difficult to insure these projects because climate change is intensifying. So we've got some things that are really stacking up against the folks who we most want to be building these projects. So the Siting Commission was tasked with, please figure out how to expedite this process. So we have recommendations from the Siting Commission, which are public. We are now in the process of translating those into a piece of legislation that is going to help us streamline this permitting process. And that means streamlining, a bunch of the reviews that go into final permitting of these projects. And I want to underscore, like just talking before about competing, potentially competing or perceived competing interests across the administration. One thing that we want to make sure that we're doing with this is be very clear about the fact that we need something like, and you correct me on this if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, it's something like 1 gigawatt of solar annually out until 2050. It's like a huge number. And I think the most that we've ever installed in a single year is 600 megawatts. So we've never done this before. And we need to do that at the same time while we're also preserving our natural and working lands. So we've got a very good potential solar study that came out from the Department of Energy Resources, like 6 or 8 months ago. And, we really looked at, where can we install it, where we're going to get the energy that we need, and we're going to get it at, a competitive price. And we can do a lot of it, infill development on rooftops, parking lot canopies. You can't do it all there. But we can do much more there than we have in the past, and that's going to be very important. So we'll be baking that in to this legislation. But this is a top priority for us, and this legislation is moving now. So I am hoping that helps alleviate it. And the transmission question is much more difficult because that is a multi-state. But we have begun to try to do more regional transmission procurements, working with other states, which is kind of a new thing for us to try. And at the federal level. Maybe you can speak to this. I can't. I know there was a recent decision that just came out from FERC that's supposed to help untie some of the transmission that we need. Because, point being, I think this was implicit in your question, the demand for additional electricity just from electrification to deal with climate change is somewhere like doubling to quadrupling the electricity demand. And that doesn't count stuff like data centers or AI. So we need a lot more electricity. So one thing I just want to leave you with, because whenever we get into this, you shake your head, you go, oh my God, how am I going to do that? We cannot forget the other side of the equation. So we do need more supply, we do need more transmission, we do need more energy infrastructure, but we also have to get much, much more efficient. And we really have to keep in mind as a top priority what we call demand side management. That is reducing our need for energy, much, much more efficient appliances, much, much more efficient homes and the like. And what can you add to that?
What can I add? I would just say, just because there's a big traffic jam on Wednesday night before Thanksgiving doesn't mean we build a 20-lane mass turnpike. And we're going to need a lot more electricity, but we don't want to build an electric grid that will just move that bulk electricity at a maximum projected rate. We want to become much smarter about how we use it, when we use it, and be able to control it much better. And that means grid modernization. All of the sensors, all of the telecommunications capabilities that go into a modern grid. And so there's a fourth transformation. Chief Hoffer talked about three. The fourth one is the transformation of the biggest machine we have, which is our electric grid. More than 100 years old, from one-way power, top down, from the generator out to you. Now all of a sudden there's two-way power. You're generating and you're sending it out. And that two-way power, it used to be that the ISO, that the grid controller agency, had a big wall map and they could show every generator. And there were 212 generators across all of the Northeast. And they all had names and you could map them and who was on and who was off. Now, with net metering and everyone producing electricity and sending it into the grid, it's impossible to put that on a map. I mean, there are millions of generators, and the clouds are moving and things are coming on and coming off at different times. So it's a digitized grid that has to happen, and that is a major transformation. The utilities have proposed electric system modernization plans with billions of dollars of investment. Because we don't want to build a 20-lane highway, we can't just wave them through at the Department of Public Utilities. There's a contested proceeding where people need to bring expert witnesses and evaluate them. That takes time. And so we have to get the rules right. We have to understand, how do utilities get incentivized to bring on those renewables and not just build more poles and wires. So that's, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for coming.